Welcome to the Daily Objective. The United Kingdom is one of the countries where the royal family or the institution of the king, or these days of the queen, is part of the identity of the country. And although the queen hasn't got any actual political role, it has a symbolic role that many people have accepted it as part of the country. Yet, should this tradition be continued, and should we be comfortable with this tradition? So there are many criticisms to the institution of the monarchy. One criticism is that it infantilizes maybe the population in terms of there are these rituals that we should pay respect to that person. Many people don't understand why. It's more like a remnant from the past. There's also the argument that it's an anti-democratic institution, and it's an institution which, again, it does not go hand in hand with the process of enlightenment and of modernity. On the other side, many people claim that, look, this institution does not harm anyone. This institution is actually not only not harming the UK, but it's adding to its tourist kind of appeal, that the Queen is a symbol, particularly in times of polarization, in times of crisis. It's a figure that encompasses what are the values of this country. Now, despite the fact that there's a division between people who support the monarchy or people who oppose the monarchy, there are various arguments against the monarchy, so maybe not every Republican or person against the monarchy has the same views. And this is what we will examine today. So we have with us Graham Smith. Hi, Graham. Graham is the CEO of a group called Republic. Maybe Razi can put the link somewhere in the chat or in the description. It is a group that is making the case for the abolition of monarchy in the UK. And Graham is going to explain his thesis, but mostly from a Republican point of view, that the monarchy is anti-democratic and that the head of the state should be chosen, should be elected directly by the people. And also we've got with us our in-house law scholar, but also historian, James Valliant. So James, looking forward to see what's your take on the topic. So I'm also gonna be a moderator because I've lived in the UK for many years, but my knowledge of constitutional law is very, very limited. So let's pass it to the experts. So Graham, what's your case against the monarchy, and what would you say to someone who says, we can't even imagine England without the Queen? Like, what would it be without her?
Well, it would be a lot better without it. I mean, I've not ever heard a good argument for the monarchy. And I mean, there are three sort of principal reasons why we should object to it. One of them is just principle, which is that it is undemocratic. It's also anti-democratic in the sense that not only is it itself obviously, not a democratic institution, but it's the values that it represents and defends are values of exclusivity, of elitism, hereditary power, and privilege, and so on. That also forces us to then compromise our democratic values. So, we also see people arguing in favor of a House of Lords, arguing that we can't trust the people to make sensible decisions and so on. So we are compromising our democratic principles in a way which I think is really damaging. The institution itself, I mean, we have in this country something called the Nolan principles, which are, they've been talked about a lot recently in relation to the government, because government is not exactly living up to the standards that we expect of public officials either. But these Nolan principles are things like accountability, openness, transparency, selflessness, and so on. And they are the principles that apply to all public officials. And the monarchy falls well short on all of those by a wide margin. One historian, just to take the issue of secrecy, one historian said it's more secretive than the CIA. They were looking at trying to research the history of the monarchy, and they said, well, I'm going to give up and do something easier and go and research the CIA's history instead, because I can get into their archives. And of course, their abuse of public money is extraordinary. But there's a whole host of things wrong with the institution itself, which is also symptomatic of an institution that is unaccountable. The whole point of democracy is that it should raise standards by saying, well, if you once you're in office, if you do things wrong, we can see it. We know what you're doing, and we can get rid of you. And the last thing is the crown and the monarchy are fundamental parts of our constitution. So, and the monarch still has a role to play in that constitution, but she has largely abdicated the role without abdicating the office, and said, well, to the Prime Minister, well, you can have all my powers, so you do what you want with them. To the point where in 2019, the Prime Minister said, well, we want to prorogue Parliament in order to avoid the opposition having an opportunity to debate and vote on issues around Brexit. And the Queen said yes. And then it came back from the High Court, the Supreme Court, that this was unconstitutional. And the argument was in defense of the monarch, because people always try and defend the monarch and blame everybody else around her. The argument was the constitutionally, the head of state is bound to do what the Prime Minister tells her, even if what he's telling her to do is unconstitutional, which is clearly a nonsense. So there are issues around that as well. So the power of the crown is actually very, very significant, but it is all in the hands of the Prime Minister. So we have a situation where power has been, through Parliament and through the crown, focused in the hands of the head of the government. So in domestic power, in terms of domestic power, the monarchy helps ensure that we have one of the most powerful heads of government in the democratic world, far more so than the US president, for example.
So I'm going to raise some more common objections to the anti-monarchist position, Graham, but let me ask also James something. So James, an individualist here, let's say you're a more classical liberal, would say, look, our rights are violated by the governments anyway. So particularly in the United Kingdom, so England had and Scotland, some of the strictest lockdowns in the Western world. We've seen things like environmental legislation or other kinds of regulations of the so-called nanny state that really harm the freedoms of everyday persons. So would you say that actually getting rid of the monarchy shouldn't be high in the agenda of someone who fights for freedom? Or do you say, or would you agree with Graham that it is an important position when it comes to defending freedom?
I think it is an important issue in several ways, but I wouldn't put it at the top of the priority list.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the most important driving issue for me, because as Graham points out, the monarchs are basically by, they don't, without a written constitution, it's simply by tradition. And so, of course, the last several monarchs have gone along with whatever Parliament has wanted, but they've done that by, in effect, voluntarily going along with it so that they don't lose their office. I think that Brits would be very upset if they had another Charles I who was, closing down Parliament and trying to rule England without a Parliament like Charles I, who got his head cut off, did. So since that time, especially since the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and Bill of Rights 1689, that stuff. But look, the Bill of Rights is an act of Parliament. They could abolish, overturn that tomorrow. The House of Commons is an absolute dictator. It has all the fascist qualities of pure democracy. Pure democracy does not confer legitimacy upon a government. Democracy is not a magic wand. But on the other hand, nor is the absolute power of a monarch. But the absolute power that de facto Parliament has today is simply a result of the absolute power in theory that the monarch has and doesn't use. I'll go along, like Graham says, I'll go along with whatever the Prime Minister, the majority government says, and that's why we'll still be alive. And so George V, George VI, the current Queen, her father and grandfather were impeccable constitutional monarchs when it came to Lords reform, when it came to, further liberal reforms. They're always going along with it to keep their jobs. I don't think Brits would put up with an absolute monarch of the 17th century type. On the other hand, in theory, the absolute dictatorship of the House of Commons is a reality without a written constitution. And it is theoretically simply an emanation of the Queen's absolute power. That she simply by sufferance, allows the House of Commons, in effect, to exercise completely. There is no written constitution. See, America is founded on a moral ideal that individual rights is what makes a government legitimate. That our Bill of Rights proudly says Congress shall make no law. That's it. No law, no matter how big your majority in Congress. You can't establish a religion. You can't censor free speech. You can't restrict religious exercise, free religious exercise. All of that happens in Britain, one of the most liberal, forward-looking, secular nations on earth. It's true. So Great Britain is among the best nations this way when it comes to liberalism on earth, comparatively speaking, Graham, comparatively speaking. So I don't think the British people would put up with an absolute monarch, but in theory, it is still an absolute monarch who's simply letting her government do whatever they want to do so that she can stay in power. It is morally repugnant, of course. A hereditary monarchy is morally repugnant. And democracy, one of the objections I'd have to Graham's first attack is that even if 99% of the British population wanted to keep the monarch, it would be wrong. It would be morally wrong. Morally wrong to have a hereditary monarch who has some special privileges, government privileges, even theoretical power. I don't care what majority says. From American moral standpoint, it's morally repugnant. America, in one fell swoop, about 240 years ago, got rid of monarchs, titles of nobility, entail, primogeniture, and the Church of England, and any established religion, in fact. And that prevented a class system from developing in America, which I think affected Great Britain well into the 20th century.
So let me push back a bit on the timing of getting rid of the monarchy. So since you both seem to agree that the role of the monarchy today is non-fundamental. So someone would say that, look, Graham, we live in times where many of the values of what it means to be British are under attack by the so-called woke people. Someone might bring up the attacks on the statues last year in the protest. So they would say that, look, all this, adding to all this, the attack in the institution of monarchy would be an attack to the identity of the country, an identity which is already under attack by fashionable activists or the so-called social justice warriors. So would you be sympathetic to this argument that attacking monarchy at this point would put you on the same bandwagon of the people who want to attack whatever resembles the history of the West or the tradition of the West or what makes West special?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's ever a bad time to go after the monarchy. The monarchy is a problem, and I agree that, you know, it doesn't matter, you know, whether I'm the only person in the country that objects to the monarchy or one of millions. It is objectionable, and you know, there is this, and I think because I think that our campaign comes from a sort of a liberal democratic tradition where, you know, you have to enforce certain democratic standards, and you have to enable, you know, a division of power, a dilution of power, and all the rest of it, and proper checks and balances. And that's, you know, all these constitutional questions do actually have a very real impact. I mean, we have a government now that is currently trying to roll back our rights. Now, we don't have that culture that you mentioned, James, where you know, our constitution is founded on this set of rights, but we have had since the 1940s, 50s, we've been part of the European Convention of Human Rights, which was a response to the horrors of the Second World War. And then in the late 90s, we brought that into domestic law with the Human Rights Act, which is also tied up with the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement. And now the government is trying to undo that. And they can do that because, like you said, it is, there was a conservative Lord Hailsham back in the 70s, who gave a speech and described our democracy as an elective dictatorship, because his concern was that not only can the Commons do whatever it pleases, but the government can do an awful lot even without reference to the Commons, and a lot of that is using Crown powers, and whether it's the Privy Council, the royal prerogatives, an awful lot of patronage, that goes on under the guise of using crown powers. I mean, there was a time when David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, halfway through his time in office, he sacked quite a few of his ministers, and he knighted all of them except one. And the only reason that one didn't get knighted because he had already been knighted previously. So, and this is a form of patronage coming directly from the crown, which allows him to curry favour, to keep people on side and say, look, you know, you're going to lose your job, but I'll give you a knighthood. Don't give me any trouble. And that patronage, that's just one example of this problem of patronage, which is just one example of the problem of the whole situation. And this create, you know, we are worried about freedoms or about the quality of government, quality of decision making, the extent to which the decisions of government and parliament are reflecting the wishes of the people, then we need to deal with the monarchy, because that's where the problem is. That is the key sort of pin. And it also, I mean, people will say, well, you know, it's also to do with the electoral system, which makes sure that you get a huge majority in the Commons, even if you don't have a majority in the election. It also comes down to the House of Lords, which is a very weak upper house. And that's all true, but you know, the monarchy gives the Prime Minister all the power to stop any discussion about changing the electoral system in the Lords. So, you know, the whole thing needs to be tackled. And there is a wider constitutional movement reform movement in the UK, but it always steers clear of this. And I think that's a big mistake. I think you need to tackle the whole thing. And to some extent, you know, the royal family, the Queen and the princes, whatever, are supported by people like you know, in government and so on, because that's a very nice, easy, fluffy, sort of acceptable way of saying, look, you know, you don't want to touch the monarchy, that would be mean to the Queen, you know. But what they're really saying is you don't want to touch the monarchy because that will take a lot of power away from you. So the royal family itself is part of the problem. And I don't think, in fact, I object quite strongly to the notion that the monarchy is a central part of our identity. I think that, you know, our liberalism is a central part of our identity. The values that we live by are, you know, our language, our culture, our history, and all the rest of it, including, you know, the objectionable parts of our history. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to revisit a lot of that objectionable part of our history and to question what statues we put up and so on. And that's also part of our identity to do that. And the monarchy is just isn't, you know, and that's reflected also in polling and in interest in the royal. So most people are not that bothered, not that interested, and do not relate to the royals in any way whatsoever.
You know, Graham, on that point, the English people are some of the most secular people in the world. They have one of the highest atheist and agnostic populations on the planet, and yet the theoretical moral basis of the monarchy is Christianity, is the Church of England.
Yes.
You're still the head of your official church. And although you've also got one of the most liberal forms of Christianity in the Anglican Church these days, nonetheless, it's still a medieval institution based on this biblical notion of hereditary monarchy, anointed kings. Their success in battle said God meant them to be the Queen currently, I'm told, really believes she's chosen of God and has a divine role to play in history. Now, I find that tension between such a secular country, some of the most atheistic and agnostic people on the planet still have a moral justification, and this is what I find at root repugnant, a moral justification grounded in Christianity, religion, and medieval tradition.
So, yeah, I mean, it's a curious thing. I mean, we've been a nation that have been sort of indifferent Christians, and we've moved to a nation of indifferent atheists, and we've sort of, so people don't really rail against that part of it, but it is a bit bizarre. I mean, it's not just the monarch, but in the House of Lords, which is the most absurd parliamentary house in the world, I would say, we have 25 or 26 members of the House of Lords who are bishops of the Church of England,
right.
And they're only there because they are serving bishops of the Church of England. And when they retire, they're normally then given a life period, which means they can continue as ordinary members of the House of Lords after being a bishop. So we have, you know, former heads of the church, for example, are still in the House of Lords. And and that's a nonsense. So when the House of Lords debate, which is sort of picked up about 20 years ago and has rumbled on off and on, is a fascinating insight into the damage the monarchy, and I think, does to our commitment to democratic values, because the debate is so absurd that when people say, well, why is the Church of England the only church to have these bishops, rather than saying, well, let's get rid of them, people say, well, let's find representatives of other religions and put them in there. It's like, well,
let's
no,
get Muslims in too, not just Christians.
I had an Australian friend. Australia has, House of Representatives and Senate, but they are obviously the same names as you have in the States, but it's actually a parliamentary system like ours, fully elected, 100%. So the Senate does the same role as the House of Lords, but has a bit more power, fully elected. And an Australian friend came over and I took him on a tour of the Parliament, and after sitting in and watching the MPs, we went round to the Lords, and the screen said that they're currently debating the role of women in society. And we sat down and looked into the chamber, and there was a Church of England bishop in all his gear talking about the role of women in society. And this is before the church had even allowed women to be bishops. And it was just embarrassing to say, well, why aren't we not electing our head of state? And I did a video a little while ago. We got a YouTube channel that people can check out. I did a video. It's called Dear America, and it basically says, look, because some people, when the January 6th Capitol riots were happening, some people in this country were saying, oh, well, isn't it, we should thank our lucky stars that we've got a constitutional monarchy. And no, that's not the lesson to take
but
from
that's
that.
One of the main arguments, Graham. Continuity. If the Parliament can't come up with a working coalition or a clear majority, or if there's a time of crisis, or just simply giving us historical perspective, I get the arguments that I get from most Brits who are in favor of a monarchy go like that. It is a fallback in times of crisis. It gives us historical continuity. How do you respond to that? See, in my view, if it wouldn't matter whether or not that's economically justifiable. It's not the question of economics, whether or not it brings in more tourism than it costs, the civil list costs the British taxpayer. To me, it's actually the morality of what's going on and whether or not,
absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
The moral question to me is it. I've done, I can stand up and say, look, it is wrong in principle, and that should be the end of the discussion. Everything else should just be ignored and just get rid of it. Done. Right. But of course, people don't. That's not enough for most people. They want to hear a pragmatic argument as well, not least because it's a reasonably big change, and they're not entirely convinced that that particular part of the moral question matters that much, because it doesn't really impact on everybody. But in terms of the continuity as a fallacy, there is continuity in any system that survives, and is the system strong enough to survive, then fine. But our system is no more or less continuous than any other system that has been around for a long time. It's probably younger, to be honest, than the US Constitution, if you think about what dates you choose.
Yeah, over the last 200 years, there have been major constitutional upheaval, Lords Reform in 1911, things like that, truly changed the Constitution.
I would argue that we became a democracy in the 1920s when we fully enfranchised everybody, and even then, we've sort of haven't quite finished the job, as we're discussing now. But this bit about in terms of crisis, you can fall back on it. That never happens. If we at the moment, this is one of the arguments that we put forward, because we don't propose Britain taking on a US-style constitution. We propose a parliamentary democracy where you have a head of state who is elected by the people to hold very limited reserved powers, and the point of that head of state is to fall back on them in times of crisis. At the moment, we have no safety net because the monarch will not act in times of crisis, and she's been very clear about this. And we've had crises. They haven't been catastrophic crises, but we've had quite serious problems, political and social and economic problems over the last 20 years. We've had a number of hung parliaments where it's been unclear as to what the result was and which government would be able to survive. And the monarch has been very clear through her representatives, we're not going to get involved. You know, it's like, well, what are we paying you the big bucks for then if you're not going to get involved? You know, if you're not going to do anything, what are you there for?
Right,
You know?
exactly.
Now,
to bring down the discussion a bit to what you said, the pragmatist argument.
Yeah.
So what about the what have you got you there, you ask? So someone would say, well, it's a net profit for the country because it brings revenue. So supporters of the monarchy say that not only doesn't cost money to the country, but actually brings money through, I don't know, people who visit or buy memorabilia, or that somehow it adds to the GDP of the country. So would you say that this is a valid piece of evidence, or is it a myth? I mean, it doesn't matter at the end of the day on principle, but just since we brought up the pragmatic, let's say, arguments.
I mean, there's no pragmatic argument for it. I mean, the tourism thing is complete nonsense. And it was dreamt up, I think. I mean, I know it was around in the 80s, and I think it started coming up in the 70s and 80s when people's deference was fast evaporating, and the royalists were desperate to say, well, you know, it's really good for tourism, because then there's something that those that don't care that much can sort of hold on to. And they've been quite successful in pushing that point, but it's nonsense. There's no evidence of it. I mean, Visit Britain is an organization in the UK that promotes Britain as a destination for overseas tourists to visit. Back in 2010, when William and Kate announced their wedding, they put out a press release saying the wedding's going to be great for tourism. So we did a Freedom of Information request to their press release, and their research department wrote to their press department saying, you can't say that, it's not true. And so they met with us, their CEO and chair met with us a few months later. And I said to them, look, bottom line, if we get rid of the monarchy, do we lose tourism? There's no evidence that I can see that we would. And he said, yes, you're right. There was no evidence of that whatsoever. They did a similar press release around the same time, suggesting that the monarchy brings in £500 million to the British economy every year. And that's the figure that has gone around, because it got picked up by someone else called Brand Finance that's gone around and been repeated a lot. But they withdrew that because that £500 million figure is completely fictional. But that £500 million figure represents 0.01% of our economy, 0.3% of our tourism industry, and 1.9% of our heritage tourist industry. You know, it's not the sort of money that's going to be noticed. But as I say, I mean, this is sort of going back to the principal point, is that, you know, our constitution should be based on our democratic needs and values, not on what people enjoy doing on their holiday. You know, that's not a reasonable thing, and it's immoral or amoral to suggest that something should be kept because it makes money, because otherwise you're just it's just a free-for-all. There are no limits on action so long as it's profitable.
Well, I think I agree in principle with the idea that the issue is a moral political one. It's not a financial one. You know, It just happens that the first time I visited Great Britain was in 1981. It had nothing to do with the marriage of Charles and Diana, which was going on that summer. But I saw London all getting spruced up right before the wedding. We went to the continent, spent a while there, came back, we saw the wedding on Italian television, came back to Britain, and it was everyone was all still goo-goo-eyed and stuff. It clearly was a national festival. It clearly was this great event. Wow, here she is, this fairy tale princess. Didn't end in a fairy tale marriage, but here's this fairy tale pretty princess marrying the most eligible bachelor in the world. And it did bring tourists, not me. I mean, it had nothing to do with me going there at the time, but I could tell as a tourist then, it was bringing tourists from all over the English-speaking world to come see that.
You say that, but the press release that FOI, the research said that the tourism numbers in 1981 were lower than they were the previous year. So you know, there was a dip. So it looks like it. And the thing is that it's not a national. I mean, I know I was only I was 7 years old in 1981, but I've spoken to my parents about this, and we went down to a town in Dawlish in Dorset, which is a seaside town, and the beach was packed. You know, it was heaving of lots of people who just weren't watching the wedding. You know, and for the wedding in 2011, you know, there's a Legoland in Windsor, And my sister tried to take her kids there, and the place was absolutely heaving. You could barely get your car anywhere near it just to get in.
More popular than Windsor Castle.
I mean, Windsor Legoland is much more popular than Windsor Castle, which is ironic. I mean, Buckingham Palace is a long way down the list of top tourist destinations. But this thing about it being a national celebration, because we've just had the Jubilee, and the media is saying it's a national celebration. The polling said it definitely isn't a national celebration. 14% said they were going to do anything about it. 11% said they were very interested. 54% said they weren't interested. And if you go around the country, the bunting, fizzles out when you get away from London and the home counties, and then you just get pockets of it. And where I live, which isn't far from London, there was hardly any activity at all. So the vast majority of people were simply enjoying the long weekend and the nice weather and ignoring the Jubilee. The media lap it up and they push it and promote it. But an analogy with America would be that if there was a inauguration or maybe the Democratic Conference or whatever, and they organized a bunch of parties all the way around the US to celebrate this event, and all of the media just said, this is amazing, everything's fabulous, look at the Bidens, aren't they amazing? Everybody is celebrating this huge democratic event, and just completely ignored everybody that disagreed. Then that's how royal events are pushed.
Gentlemen.
And it creates a very distorted view of the way the British think about it, because I get loads of these big events are good for us. We get loads of media interviews, but the pitch normally is, look, I've been talking to all these British people about the Jubilee or the wedding. I'd quite like to talk to someone who isn't so interested. And I thought, well, yes, on that point, isn't so interested. I'm in the vast majority, but you're already getting into this by thinking that I'm a person who's not so interested.
Graham, it's absolutely crazy. I live in a country that chucked the monarchs 240 years ago, and yet there's so many millions of Americans who just go goo-goo eyes over British royalty. If you've got a British title and you come to America, they just go nuts.
But it's interesting
that's fine. You don't have to put up with it. You'd have a problem if let's say that Biden turns around and says, look, we're going to introduce some changes to our constitution. Firstly, the constitution is going to be reduced to acts of Congress. And secondly, all of my powers I'm going to give to the majority leader in the House. But I'm going to keep this job for life. And when I die, Hunter Biden will take it off me. And that's the new system. And we're going to abolish we're not going to abolish the Senate. What we're going to do is find a whole bunch of landowners and find 92 of them and put them in the Senate, and they will be hereditary. And then we're going to allow the leaders of the two parties in the Congress to appoint all the other senators. And then we'll take the Anglican Church of the United States and find some bishops and put them in the Senate. That is what we have. And that's mad. That is just completely crazy.
Gentlemen, we have to go to super chats because we haven't got much time and our audience has questions. So super chat from Phil. Thank you very much, Phil. Should the desire for a republic be based on the altruism of equality or the rationality of fairness as per Ayn Rand and her description of the sanction of the victim? So basically, you've already touched upon this, James, but is replacing someone unaccountable for having a rule over your life, is replacing them with everyone else having a rule over your life by their decision, this egalitarian that Phil describes, is this actually a development?
Well, see, I regard what I said before is absolutely true. I regard pure democracy as no more morally legitimate than hereditary monarchy. No, for a government to be legitimate and moral, it has to respect fundamental rights, the fundamental liberties of individuals. And without that moral base, without the language, without the moral idealism, I'm going to be proud about my own country here. Without the moral idealism and the philosophical base given by the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and the glorious speeches by Abraham Lincoln, it's that moral political code that really is the basis for this. It wouldn't matter to me at all. As I say before, the costs are irrelevant to me. The popularity is irrelevant to me. But what we have in Great Britain is, in effect, an absolute democracy through the House of Commons, which exists de facto as a reflection of the purely theoretical, absolute power of the monarch. The two are connected. If you don't have rights, individual rights that are placed above any Christian medieval tradition or pure fascist democracy, then neither is legitimate as far as I'm concerned. I would advocate a written constitution if I were a Brit, and I'm not, so it's really none of my business. But the point is, I'd still go around criticizing governments, and as my own government too. It seems to me that Great Britain should have a written constitution that ensures fundamental liberties to the individual. That is what gives a government moral legitimacy in my mind, neither democratic or some hereditary monarchy because it's Christian. Neither is legitimate for me.
I completely agree. And I mean, there is this old thing about, the tyranny of the majority is no better than the tyranny of one. And I think it was Ayn Rand that said something along the lines of, the majority don't have the right to do a wrong. And, and that's absolutely right. And I agree. I mean, part of our proposition is that we have a written constitution and that the head of state is there to defend that constitution should parliament and government try to do something which contradicts it. And what that does, I mean, some people say, well, what's wrong with the courts doing that as they do in the US? You would hope. The courts can also do that, but this stops it even getting into legislation and having to rely on citizens going to court. If you have an elected person who is otherwise is going around cutting ribbons, but if the parliament passes a law that is unconstitutional, they can challenge it. And this has happened in Ireland on a few occasions. I mean, they have brilliant heads of state, certainly over the last 30 years. On the whole, they do the sort of representational ambassadorial role, but if a piece of legislation is passed which the president thinks is unconstitutional, they've got advisors around them, and then they can send it to court for adjudication, or they can send it back to parliament to review it and rewrite it and so on. So it gives a very clear protection. And we have this idea in Britain called the sovereignty of parliament, and people talk about it as in hushed tones, as if this is some kind of great principle that should be defended, and it just shouldn't be defended any more than the
monarch parliament, right? Technically, the theory of sovereignty is the main theories of sovereignty that I've heard of late, the monarch in parliament. So the monarch has to give her imprimatur to the creation of a parliament.
I mean, it's all fiction, a lot of it. I mean, crown in parliament is this idea that these sovereign powers now rest in parliament, and therefore there's no limit to what parliament can do. The only limits that are on parliament in the UK are the ones that we've put on ourselves, and a lot of those were bound up with the EU, and we're now out of that, and a lot of those still are bound up with international treaties, which this government seems to have no concern about. And the other tranche of those obligations on Parliament come down to the European Convention on Human Rights, which this government is trying to override or remove itself from, which puts us in the camp with Belarus. So it's and this is the problem, and this is a fundamental part of the whole Republican argument, that it's not simply being anti-monarchy, saying get rid of these bunch of wasters and put in someone who's going to do what the Prime Minister tells them. It's let's have a proper constitution that respects everybody's rights and respects the fact. I mean, I've said to people, democracy only makes sense if it's founded on the idea that we are all political equals, and therefore we have all an equal stake. And that means that there has to be some limit on what decisions democratic decisions can do to you, and that's where human rights come into it. You can't, at the moment, the speech that I mentioned before about in the 70s, Lord Hailsham, it's worth looking at. I think he describes that, Parliament could summon a man to the Commons, try him, find him guilty, sentence him to death, and have it carried out, and there's not a power in the land that can stop it, which is an extraordinary situation.
It was one of the things we got rid of on our U.S. Constitution. You had no bills of attainder, nothing like that. Separation of powers. Yeah.
Okay, gentlemen, next super chat is from Gail, who asks, is it true that the House of Lords, which is based, quote, on royal blood heredity, has been entrenched for roughly 1,000 years. Is it so old?
Yeah, I mean,
longer.
longer, I would say. I mean, it was the original parliament, and it sort of emerged out of sort of councils that advised the monarch, and then they also allowed commoners, by which I don't mean in a democratic sense. I mean people who weren't nobility but were major landowners, for example, and then it eventually got split into these two houses. But the weird thing is, at the moment we have the House of Lords is about 800 or 900 members, and it is a system of corrupt patronage mainly. Only about 300 of them actually turn up and do any work. 92 of them are still hereditary. So 92 of them are people who, up until 97, 98, whenever it was, when Blair got rid of most of them, he wanted to get rid of all the hereditaries, and he did a deal and said, well, okay, you can keep 92. Now, the absurdity is that there are a lot more hereditary peers out there that have these titles, but only 92 of them are allowed to sit in the House. If one of them dies, the other hereditary peers from the same party then have a vote to choose one of the ones that doesn't yet currently have a seat to then come into the Lords. So the irony is the only people ever elected to the House of Lords are hereditary peers. So that is fairly absurd. But most of them are people who have been appointed by party leaders.
Yeah, one thing about the House of Lords that does interest me is that people who have achieved certain status are sort of given a lifetime position to be in there, life lords. And if they are in politics and they make it out to being life lords, there may be some advantage to having their ongoing wisdom in the government. But the idea that the government is making, the director of the Shakespeare theater, Lord Olivier, because of his, it seems strange to me. Most of these in the history of Great Britain, you've got like the Dukes of Marlborough, the Dukes of Wellington. They did great military things for Great Britain. Or you've got, some of them are illegitimate descendants of monarch. Charles I had a whole raft of illegitimate kids, and many of them are dukes. The descendants of them are many of dukes. Yeah. So if you did some great favor to the king, if you were successful in battle, you'd get this title. But it would be a hereditary title that would go by entail and primogeniture. And it created a class system of absolutely opposed what we would call Lockean liberal property rights altogether. It kept it in its tight-knit aristocratic family, going from father to son, as long as that male line existed. A primitive medieval hereditary system.
I think that system has been fundamental to the sustaining the monarchy, and also a huge number of other problems that we have: the inequality, the class system, all the rest of it. And because these people, most of us don't know anything about these people, but they're all there, sort of subtly influencing things, giving money to the right people, supporting the right causes, and whatever, and holding quite a lot of influence over quite a lot of parts of our culture and society. And I think that, getting rid of other titles, the fact that, for example, the president is referred to as Mr. President and not given any kind of noble title is hugely important. I think there shouldn't be any titles of any kind. And we also have these award systems, when people call themselves Sir, there's big actors like Patrick Stewart, from X-Men and Star Trek and whatever. I mean, and he's Sir Patrick, which is a nonsense. I mean, it's an absolute farce. And I just think if you are someone that is A, willing to take such a title, and B, wants people to use it, then you're probably not someone I necessarily want to know. I just think it's rather pathetic. But it is a part of patronage and corruption. Which
they were here at Ayn Rand Center UK. A friend and a student of Ayn Rand's, Alan Greenspan, was given a knighthood, and it's a strange thing when Americans who have distinguished careers are actually given an Order of the British Empire or something by the Queen. Throughout the English-speaking world, people are given these special titles. Now, they mean nothing in America. Thank goodness they mean nothing in America. But still, Americans, again, go googly-eyed over getting some OBE from the Queen.
Okay, gentlemen, we have minus 1 minute, and we have 3 more super chats, so I'm going to read them on. You address whichever you want. So Marilyn says, I think Elizabeth is a class act, but look at her progeny. And I would add, it's interesting that she's a class act mainly by doing nothing. So this is what makes her class, which says a lot about the institution. Bonnie says, abolish the monarchy and replace it with what? No one has yet produced a rights protecting, valid and rationally moral concept of government anywhere. And Marilyn says, the people who go nuts over the British monarchy are the same people who read the National Enquirer. So, and what actually has been happening is that in the UK also, royal families mostly now celebrities, and they see themselves that way. So you comment on anything of that as final thoughts, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
I just agree with Mary-Elaine.
Parting words from Graham?
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you think that the Queen is a class act, you know, she's been good at being the Queen, and that she is her own yardstick. And but you know, if you look at what she has and hasn't done, I think that it's a 70 years of missed opportunity when we could have had a series of class acts chosen by us to do exceptional jobs, as we have. I mean, if you look at the elected heads of state in Europe, in parliamentary democracies where they're not running the government, there have been some extraordinary people, as with the current president of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins, Richard von Weizsäcker in Germany, who was an exceptional and hugely popular president, Joachim Gauck, who was the last German president, Vigdis Finnbogadóttir of Iceland, who was the first woman ever to be elected to the post of head of state of a nation, who was hugely popular. And we have had just one queen who does and says nothing, and is closeted away and hidden away and protected by layers of secrecy. And yet there are plenty of mistakes, I think, that she's made, but people are not willing to call her out for it. The alternative, I think we've talked about. I mean, there is an alternative. You know, it's not difficult to imagine. No system is perfect. Every system is a process of, is always in the process of development. I mean, the Irish constitution is pretty excellent, but there are certainly still problems with it. But they have had quite a few referendums over the last 70 years to change it, as attitudes and views and issues come to the fore. But they can protect rights. They can protect their position within the EU, or choose to leave the EU. You know, they've got all these rights which they exercise through referendum. So they can control their constitution. And on the point of celebrity, I mean, this is the problem that they face, is that the Queen is seen as royalty in the real sense, because she goes back to the war and the pre-war time and the time of British Empire and all that kind of pageantry and nonsense, and she is synonymous with the monarchy. Charles is not. William is not. I mean, he was booed at a football match not that long ago, and when he was standing in Jamaica looking at Jamaican troops on parade, he just looked like, you know, pretty ordinary bloke who might work in accounts. And I think this is the problem, is that they are now reduced to tax-funded Kardashians. And if people want the Kardashians, that's great. Enjoy it. Buy the newspapers, but don't expect the rest of us to fork out hundreds of millions of pounds.
Supported Kardashians. I love that. And you know,
supported Kardashians should be the headline of today's episode.
Yeah, but no matter how nice or moral the Queen or her parents may have been, the institution of monarchy cannot rely, because that's the problem with hereditary monarchy. You could get good, decent one in one generation, but how do you know their kids or grandkids are going to be half as decent? It's just hereditary privilege is just wrong.
One very quick point on that is that, if you know, you can say that someone is moral and nice and all the rest of it, but my view is that if you are prepared to take a public job as head of state because your father had it or your mother had it, then that instantly brings into doubt your moral compass and your principles. And I don't think you are the last person that should be the head of state.
That's a very interesting.
Thank you very much. So
thank you. Yeah, thanks for discussion.
You can find more in about Graham in republic.org.uk, which is the website of the group which opposes the monarchy. Graham, thank you very much for your time. James, as always,
thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure, and we're gonna talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Bye.